joining us now is a guest who can help us answer a question that many people have been struggling with in recent months. Timothy Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University. He is a leading public intellectual in the fields of fascism and the Holocaust, 20th century studies. And he joins us now to discuss his latest book, which is in fact entitled On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. So, Professor Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Very glad to be with you.
And I will start with this. I think I know the answer to this question, and I think some of our viewers will as well, but and listeners, but just briefly, what was the impetus for writing this book?
The book's a kind of homecoming for me. I'm an American citizen, and I wrote the book for my country, but I wrote it coming from the particular perspective of someone who spent 25 years trying to understand the worst chapters of European history. What I'm trying to do in the book is bring what I think I've learned from the wisest people who survived or who lived through fascism, communism, other political disasters. In the book, I try to bring in a crystallized and accessible way the wisdom of those experiences to us so that I could reach people who were disoriented by the events of last November. My bet, and it turns out to be correct, was that there would be lots of Americans who would be disoriented and depressed but not sure exactly what to do. The point of the book is to try to bring historical wisdom to bear so that we can act quickly and act well.
Well, I want to start out in response by saying I've read the book. I think, first of all, it's extremely well written, so thank you for that. I am always deeply grateful when someone appreciates the art and craft of writing well for the public. In fact, I think you say in the book, if I've got the quote correctly, be kind to our language, make an effort to separate yourself from the internet, read books. So thanks for that observation as well. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say then that some of the singular, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that some of the singular characteristics of Donald Trump may have had something to do with the decision to write this book at this time?
No, of course that's correct. I mean, the book came out very fast, but we have to remember that for the book to exist now, I had to write it half a year ago, which I did. So I wrote the book before the inauguration. So when the book seems to anticipate events that take place, that's a kind of argument for the usefulness of history, I think. But yes, of course, throughout 2016, I was very concerned by this candidate. I was concerned by the fascist patterns of rhetoric he used at his rallies. I was concerned by his obvious disregard for the rule of law and for democracy. And I was generally concerned because, perhaps unlike other Americans, I come from the assumption that it can happen here. When I look at my friends or my teachers or my colleagues in other countries where democracy is falling or has fallen, I don't think that they are any less wise or any less capable than we are. So I saw what was happening in the United States as part of a global trend towards authoritarianism, and I wanted to do what I could do about it.
Well, and I think that's very well said. And I think one of the reasons why I was so looking forward to speaking with you is because one of the fundamental questions that you know better than I as a historian that people have struggled with ever since World War II is the issue of what in more gendered or less gender evolved times was described as the great man theory of history. Great, in this case, not meaning necessarily good, but powerful, versus the idea that larger forces are usually at play and the emergence of individuals. I'm thinking of whether it's a Hitler or a positive force or a Trump or whoever it might be, that individuals are the products of larger forces. And I was very interested in asking you, both in terms of World War II and the present day, where you come out on the, if not great, influential person theory of history versus the forces at work. And I know I'm oversimplifying, but hopefully you understand the question.
Let me try to take that in the most basic historical way that I can. It's the answer, of course, is all of the above. Individuals matter, circumstances matter, and major personalities can matter. But what the balance between those things can depend upon the moment. So let's take a very important historical moment, 1933 in Nazi Germany. Hitler's party, the National Socialist Party, can win an election in November of 1932 because of the Great Depression. That's a larger circumstance. Hitler is an unusual personality with a very specific ideology and therefore the potential to change the world, which of course he will do. And yet, in 1933, before Hitler and the Nazis consolidated their hold on the state, everyday German citizens still had a great deal of ability to alter the future. One of the major lessons of 1933, which I think most historians would agree on, and we don't agree about much, is that authoritarians at the beginning require a great deal of consent, even if it's only consent in the sense of subconscious implicit adjustment to the new reality. So that's the reason why in the book on tyranny, the very first lesson is don't obey in advance. In our historical moment where we are right now, we perhaps have more influence than we think. If we withhold our consent and think about what matters most to us, we can actually make a historical difference.
Well, I think that's very well said, and it gets to a concern I have had over recent months. Not so much, not about your book or what you've said, but about the way people in general are taking, let me express it this way, Timothy Snyder, I'm concerned about something that I think of as Trump exceptionalism, the idea that Trump stands radically outside the orbit of, let's say, Republican behavior or the behavior of certain subset of influential Americans, or that his followers are unusual. I'm concerned that in opposing Trump, which is, I personally oppose him quite strongly, vehemently, is that we not think that it's just about Trump. And, Trump may have dreadful personality characteristics that people react negatively to, but I'm always concerned about placing the Trump phenomenon in the context of the world as it exists today, so we don't find ourselves combating Trump, but letting other forces in through the door that will do us long-term harm as well. What are your thoughts about that?
I agree with that perspective completely. And I mean, to your list, I would add the prior problems of growing inequality and the anti-democratic or non-democratic features of the way that we choose our leaders, such as the gerrymandering, the money in politics, the electoral college, and the voter suppression laws. And there's a reason why on tyranny, although I'm happy to say, if I'm asked, that it was elicited by the election of Mr. Trump, there's a reason why on tyranny I don't mention Donald Trump's name. And that is because I want to avoid getting into all of this business about personality and character. There's a temptation to think that if you diagnose the madness, then somehow you've solved the problem. But you haven't. He is the way he is. He will bump up against the system the way he will. And the point is that whether he bumps up against the system and breaks it or not depends upon us. So, my fundamental answer to your question is that the courses of action that I offer on tyranny are not about talking about Mr. Trump. They're about doing specific things. And the idea is that doing these things will defend the institutions, but it will also make us into the kinds of people, hopefully, who will be able to improve these institutions and improve the United States of America when we come out at the other end of all of this.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And when I go down your list, before your book was written, and I think it's much more exhaustive than the other list that many of us saw on the internet of, I think it was 12 things to look out for in the advent of fascism or whatever. I remember looking at that list of 12 and thinking, well, 6 or 7 of them were already well underway before Trump came on the scene. And I guess the reason why yours are much more thoughtful, but when I look at your list, do not obey in advance, depend institutions, beware the one, all of them, take responsibility for the face of the world, remember professional ethics. I can think of many of us being called upon to consider these and reflect on these and practice these, again, with or without Donald Trump. It might be Paul Ryan, it might be Mitch McConnell, it might be somebody completely separate from that, it might be our governor, it might be, but would you agree with that these are principles that to a greater or lesser extent might be in play at any given time and not just on the brink of fascism?
Yeah, no, I take your point. If anything, I would make it in a slightly more radical way. I mean, I'm with the framers of the Constitution. I'm very skeptical about human nature. I'm very skeptical about us. Even if your very favorite leader happened to be President of the United States and your second favorite leader were your governor, these would still be good things to do because our political order, as we imagine it ideally, and our civil society, as we should be practicing it daily, depend upon us. So that's actually, I mean, your question actually captures something which I think is important about the book. These are daily or at least regular actions which even a healthy political society would need. These are not the kinds of things that you can just drop. The book is meant as a kind of reminder that civil society and political order depend upon all of us all the time, in good moments and in bad. Now, that said, I would still stress that I think there's a particular urgency of the present moment where the institutions that we have, our imperfect institutions, are under greater threat now than they might have been in another set of circumstances.
And I strongly agree with that statement as well. First of all, I have to say I love it when guests take my statements and make them even more radical. So kudos to you for that. Secondly, and this concern about ourselves as a polity, I share it, especially if it's more, let's say, Jeffersonian or less Hamiltonian. But that's a separate conversation. It's less the elite based and so on. But as far as the uniqueness of the moment, I certainly agree there is a uniqueness to the moment. But I also want to get your thoughts on. I've had a certain concern about my colleagues at times on the left, or not so much on the left, but certainly the Democratic liberal side. Perhaps there's maybe going into a level of self-mythologizing about what it means to be part of a resistance. You're a historian. You know that to be a part of an actual resistance against fascism involves death, involves torture, involves loss of your loved ones. And I worry when the focus of resisting Trump or resisting what's happening in the present moment becomes too self-focused rather than focused on what we need to do collectively. Am I onto something, or am I worrying about something that isn't real?
I don't know who you talk to, but let me take a stab at it. It seems so. Where I'm coming from, both in my own work, but also in my set of friends and acquaintances, is a place where historically people have been killed in huge numbers. Mm-hmm. I was taught by people who were in concentration camps and whose family members were killed in totalitarian societies. I have students now who themselves have been arrested or detained or have been seriously injured or, sadly, in some cases, killed. So I'm looking from that perspective onto the United States. And from there, there's immense learning to be had. You can learn from people who have been through more than you have. But some of the learning is actually encouraging because where we are now, and we learn this from people who have been through the worst stages. Where we are now, we still have a good deal of agency, and we still have a good deal of power, which means we still have a great deal of responsibility. I'm with you that being resisting isn't about talking about resisting at all. It's about doing, and it's about doing regularly. It's about working on areas where you know something. It's about knowing people and getting to know people. It's about regularity. It's not necessarily dramatic, but it does require getting your face away from the internet and getting off your duff every now and again.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And whether that's marching in the street, whether it's the way you handle your personal interactions, as you address in the book. And I guess what I'm talking about is a matter, another dimension, and maybe we'll close with your thoughts on this, which is that it's not just enough to, if you're being well paid or your job is to oppose Donald Trump or whomever, to use the hashtag resist on tweets 20 times a day and say I'm part of the resistance because I don't support Donald Trump. It's about, fundamentally to me, and this is what I'd love your thoughts on, it's about a change of heart that says if I have to risk those things that people before me risked and died for to protect the things I believe in, I'll do it. And if you're willing to do that, you're willing to put your life on the line, you've made a fundamental transformation that makes you a better person whatever happens in the future. So your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, look, your you're preaching to the choir. I mean, there's a reason why lesson 20 of the book is be as courageous as you can. One doesn't want to speak of these things lightly, of course. It's terrible when people have to risk their lives, but I agree with you that it's important to think about what you actually value and how much you actually value it, and to think ahead to situations where you might actually have to take risks, because or greater risks rather than the small risks we take now. Because if you don't do that, then you're not being honest with yourself. And I also agree that if you think you're way ahead a little bit, it helps you to comport yourself better in the present. You know, it's a little bit like if you have to break a board with your hand, the only way to do it is to imagine your hand on the other side of the board. And once you've done that, you know, hopefully it never comes to the point where you actually have to perform the action. But yeah, I agree with you. It's really the key virtues are self-awareness, humility, which means learning from people in other countries and learning from history, and then regularity, just getting out and doing the stuff that you can do. Talking about yourself or using hashtags, of course, is really not so important.
Well, it sounds like we're very much of a like mind on this, and I do recommend your book. It is very enlightening and worth studying. So Timothy Snyder, Houghton Professor of History at Yale University and author of On Tyranny, thanks so much for coming on the program.
I'm really glad I could. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.